Welcome to Synapse Daily, the Siberian Camelot. Chapter 1, The Genesis of a Scientific Dream, The Escape to the Taiga. Today, we journey to a place that shouldn't exist. Map your mind to 1957. The Soviet Union is a monolith of iron and ideology. But in Moscow, the gears of progress are grinding against the rust of bureaucracy. Mikhail Lavrentiev, a world-class mathematician and a man of immense pragmatic vision, looked at the map of the USSR and saw a void. That void was Siberia. For decades, Siberia was a synonym for exile and the Gulag. Lavrentiev wanted to flip that narrative. He didn't see a wasteland, he saw a fortress. Along with Sergei Sobolev and Sergei Krishtianovich, he proposed the creation of the Siberian branch of the Academy of Sciences. The goal was simple but audacious: to move the greatest minds of the nation thousands of miles away from the central planners of Moscow. Why? Because science requires a different kind of oxygen than politics. In Moscow, every research grant was a battle of sycophancy. In the woods of Novosibirsk, near the newly created Ob Reservoir, Lavrentiev envisioned a science city, Akademgorodok. He chose a site surrounded by ancient birch and pine forests. The air was crisp, the winters were brutal, but the intellectual climate was intended to be a permanent spring. In these early years, the thaw under Nikita Khrushchev provided the necessary political cover. Khrushchev wanted to catch up to and surpass the West. He was told that Siberia held the keys to infinite resources: oil, gas, and diamonds, but only science could unlock them. Lavrentiev played on this ambition. He promised the state industrial dominance in exchange for a degree of autonomy that was practically treasonous elsewhere in the Soviet Union. As the first wooden cabins were erected in what would be called the Golden Valley, a call went out across the Soviet universities. It wasn't a draft, it was an invitation to a dream. Young scientists, many in their 20s and 30s, left the comforts of the capital. They traveled by train for days, carrying boxes of slide rules, prohibited poetry, and a desperate hunger for truth. They were building more than labs, they were building a sanctuary where cybernetics wasn't a dirty word and where the laws of physics took precedence over the laws of the party. Like this video. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more fascinating stories. Chapter 2, The 1968 Expansion, Breaking the Permafrost. Host, by 1968, the Science City was no longer an experiment, it was a powerhouse. But the world was changing. The space race was at a fever pitch. The Cold War was entering a more dangerous, technological phase. The Soviet leadership realized that the original footprint of Akademgorodok was too small for the future they envisioned. This led to the massive 1968 expansion. Imagine the scale. Billions of rubles were diverted from traditional military projects into the expansion of this Siberian oasis. This wasn't just about adding more apartments, it was about specialized infrastructure. We saw the rise of the Budkur Institute of Nuclear Physics, which would become the crown jewel of the city. Here, they weren't just studying atoms, they were pioneering the concept of colliding beam accelerators. While the rest of the world looked at the USSR as a place of tractors and steel mills, in the 1968 expansion of Akademgorodok, they were building the VPP-2, a machine that sought to understand the very fabric of reality. The architecture of the expansion reflected this transition. Gone were the humble wooden huts. They were replaced by Soviet modernism. These were bold, brutalist structures of glass and concrete that seemed to defy the surrounding wilderness. The Institute of Cytology and Genetics was expanded during this time, a move that was a silent victory over the ghost of Lysenkoism, the pseudoscience that had crippled Soviet biology for decades. The expansion also meant a massive influx of personnel. By 1968, the population surged toward 50,000. But these weren't just any residents. This was perhaps the highest concentration of PhDs per square meter on the planet. The city was divided into zones. The upper zone for the elite institutes and the residences of the academicians, and the lower zone for the workers and technicians. Yet, despite the hierarchy, there was a shared sense of mission. They were racing against the Americans, yes, but they were also racing against their own history. Every new laboratory wing built in 1968 was a brick in a wall that separated them from the dogmatic stagnation of the past. Chapter 3, The Daily Life of a Soviet Polymath, Caviar and Cybernetics. Host, what was the texture of life during the 1968 expansion? To understand Akademgorodok, you have to understand Order 13. In a country where the deficit was a way of life, or a simple pair of jeans or a piece of fresh fruit was a luxury, the scientists of the Science City lived in a parallel universe. Order 13 was a special supply system. It meant that the grocery stores in the upper zone were stocked with items that wouldn't be seen in Moscow for decades. Fresh pineapples in the middle of a Siberian January. Real butter. Canned meats from Europe. This wasn't just to keep them fed, it was a deliberate strategy to ensure that their minds never wandered toward the mundane struggles of Soviet life. If you don't have to wait in a 4-hour line for bread, you have 4 more hours to solve the equations of plasma physics. But the real luxury wasn't the food. It was the information. The 1968 expansion saw the growth of the Under the Integral Café, Pod Integralum. This was the city's beating heart. Imagine a smoke-filled room where a nuclear physicist is debating a philosopher about the merits of Jean-Paul Sartre, while a jazz band plays in the background. In 1968, jazz was the music of the capitalist enemy, yet in Akademgorodok, it was the soundtrack of the labs. The café was a space for the integralists, a club that organized everything from beauty pageants to prohibited art exhibitions. This was the only place in the USSR where you could find a dedicated cybernetics department that wasn't under the thumb of the military. They viewed the world as a system of information, a concept that was inherently threatening to a centralized, top-down government. Walking down Morskoy Prospect in 1968, you would see people dressed in Western styles, carrying translated copies of Hemingway and Orwell. They felt invincible. They believed that because the state needed their brains to build missiles and satellites, the state would tolerate their thirst for freedom. It was a beautiful, dangerous delusion. They were living in a bubble of enlightenment, surrounded by a frozen ocean of totalitarianism. Chapter 4, The 1968 Crackdown, The Breaking of the Glass. Host, the dream of the 1968 expansion reached its zenith in early spring, but the shadow of the Prague Spring was lengthening. In Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček was trying to create socialism with a human face. In Akademgorodok, the scientists thought they had already achieved it. But Moscow was watching. The Soviet leadership, now under Leonid Brezhnev, was growing terrified of the creeping liberalism coming out of the Siberian woods. They saw the Under the Integral Café not as a club for geniuses, but as a hotbed of sedition. The expansion had brought in thousands of young, impressionable minds, and the party was losing control of the narrative. The breaking point came with the Letter of the 46. In early 1968, a group of scientists signed a public protest against the closed-door trials of 4 Moscow dissidents, Galenskov, Ginsburg, Dobrovolsky, and Lashkova. This was unheard of. For elite members of the Soviet establishment to publicly criticize the judiciary was an act of extreme courage or extreme naivety. The response was a cold, calculated purge. The party didn't send the scientists to the Gulag, they were too valuable for that. Instead, they destroyed their lives from within the system. Grants were cancelled. Lab space was reallocated. The Under the Integral Café was shut down and replaced by a sterile, party-controlled cafeteria. The physical expansion of the city continued, the buildings were finished, the labs were opened, but the spirit was broken. Mikhail Lavrentiev was forced to preside over the ideological correction of his own creation. The 1968 crackdown turned the Siberian Camelot into a gilded cage. The message was clear: you can have your caviar, and you can have your particle accelerators, but your soul belongs to the state. The era of the thaw was over. The era of stagnation had begun, and the silence that fell over the birch forests of Akademgorodok would last for 20 years. Chapter 5, The Genius Factory, The School for Prodigies. Host, if the 1968 expansion was the city's body, the SESC, the Specialized Educational Scientific Center, was its nervous system. Lavrentiev knew that buildings eventually crumble. To make Akademgorodok immortal, he needed a constant stream of fresh, untainted minds. He needed a school unlike any other in the world. In the late 60s, the USSR launched the All-Siberian Olympiads. It was a dragnet for genius. They sent exams to the most remote villages in the Arctic Circle. They looked for children who didn't just know the answers, but children who asked the right questions. The winners were brought to Akademgorodok. They were 14, 15, 16 years old. They were the Janissaries of the Taiga. By 1968, the school's new campus was a hub of intense intellectual heat. These teenagers didn't have a standard curriculum. They were taught by world-class physicists who had just stepped out of their labs. There were no teachers, only researchers. They lived in dormitories where the common room debates lasted until 4 a.m. But imagine the psychological cost. You are a child of the wilderness, suddenly thrust into a world of quantum mechanics and high-level calculus. You are told you are the future of the state. The expansion provided the beds and the blackboards, but it also created a pressure cooker. Many of these students would go on to build the foundations of the modern internet, yet in 1968, they were just kids trying to stay warm in a dormitory, dreaming of equations that could change the world. Chapter 6: The Silicon Taiga, Cybernetics and the Binary Rebellion. Host: We often think of Silicon Valley as the birthplace of the digital age. But in 1968, a parallel digital revolution was happening in the Siberian snow. This was the expansion of the Institute of Automation and Electrometry. Here, the forbidden science of cybernetics was finally being put to work. Why was cybernetics forbidden? Because in a totalitarian state, information is power. If a computer can model the economy, does the Central Committee still need to exist? This was the question that haunted the party. But the scientists in Akademgorodok didn't care about politics, they cared about efficiency. During the 1968 expansion, the city became a playground for early mainframe computers like the BSM-6. These machines were massive, filling entire rooms with vacuum tubes and cooling fans. The scientists were trying to create a networked state. They envisioned a USSR where every factory and every farm was linked by a digital brain. It was a proto-internet, decades before Tim Berners-Lee. The expansion of 1968 provided the physical space for these electronic brains. But the hardware was always one step behind the software of their minds. They were coding in a vacuum, often building their own components from scratch. This was the Silicon Taiga, a place where the binary code was seen as a language of pure logic, far removed from the messy, illogical world of Soviet propaganda. Chapter 7: The Double-Edged Sword, Pure Science vs. the War Machine. Host: Here is the uncomfortable truth about the 1968 expansion. It wasn't just funded by the love of knowledge. It was funded by the fear of war. The Soviet Union was in a desperate arms race with the United States. To the Kremlin, Akademgorodok was a laboratory for weapons. Every pure discovery had a shadow. The Institute of Nuclear Physics was exploring high-energy particles, but those same particles could be used to design more efficient warheads. The mathematicians working on fluid dynamics were also calculating the trajectories of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. This created a moral duality within the city. Many scientists saw themselves as citizens of the world, working for the benefit of all humanity. But their paychecks came from the Ministry of Defense. During the 1968 expansion, new closed zones were established. These were labs so secret they didn't appear on the city's official maps. Did the scientists know their work was being weaponized? Of course they did. But they made a pact with the devil. They accepted the funding, the luxury, and the secret labs because it gave them the tools to explore the universe. It was a high-stakes game of don't ask, don't tell. In 1968, the expansion made Akademgorodok the most sophisticated research hub in the East, but it also made it a vital gear in the Soviet military-industrial complex. Chapter 8: The Gilded Hierarchy, the Architecture of Inequality. Host: Akademgorodok was supposed to be a classless utopia. A place where the only thing that mattered was the size of your brain. But the 1968 expansion revealed a growing, gilded hierarchy. Even in the middle of Siberia, some people were more equal than others. The city was designed with a specific social geography. At the top were the cottages. These were luxurious, multi-story houses for the academicians, hidden behind tall fences and birch groves. These men lived like Western millionaires, with private drivers and access to imported goods. Then came the upper zone, where the senior researchers lived in high-quality apartment blocks. And finally, the lower zone, where the technicians, the janitors, and the construction workers lived in standard, cramped Soviet housing. The expansion of 1968 solidified these boundaries. Curiosity sparks: could a janitor's son ever hope to move to a cottage? Only if he won the math Olympiad. Social mobility was tied strictly to intellectual merit. This created a strange, competitive atmosphere. People didn't compete for money. Money was useless in a country with nothing to buy. They competed for status and access. By the end of 1968, the city was a perfect microcosm of the Soviet dream and the Soviet reality. It was a place of soaring scientific achievement, but it was also a place of rigid social structure. The expansion had built a city of the future, but it had also imported the oldest human problem of all: the gap between those who lead and those who follow. Chapter 9: The Ghost in the Machine, the Eye of the First Department. Host: every paradise has its serpent. In Akademgorodok, the serpent lived in the first department. As the 1968 expansion added more labs and more personnel, it also added more microphones. Every institute, whether it was studying the stars or the soil, had a first department. This was the KGB's office. They weren't there to learn physics. They were there to watch the physicists. The irony was palpable. The state had built a city for geniuses to think freely. Then, it hired thousands of people to make sure they didn't think too freely. In the late 60s, the surveillance was subtle but constant. If you hosted a foreign scientist, the first department knew. If you listened to the BBC World Service on a shortwave radio, they knew. We tell the story of a young researcher who found a bug in his desk. He didn't report it. He simply used it to read his grocery list aloud every morning. It was a small act of defiance. But for others, the surveillance was crushing. The 1968 expansion created a culture of doublethink. You had your public face, the loyal Soviet researcher, and your private face, the seeker of truth. The tragedy of Akademgorodok was that the state never understood that you cannot have one without the other. By trying to control the mind, they eventually poisoned the science. Chapter 10: The Sea of Ob, the Siberian Riviera and Hidden Depths. Host: but life wasn't all labs and paranoia. To keep the minds sharp, the expansion focused on the environment. Lavrentiev insisted that no tree be cut down without permission. The city was built into the forest, not on top of it. The centerpiece was the Ob Reservoir, known locally as the Ob Sea. In the summer, the white sandy beaches were filled with scientists in swimsuits, playing volleyball and debating the Big Bang. It was the Siberian Riviera. This proximity to nature was a vital part of the 1968 expansion plan. It was meant to be a holistic environment. However, there were darker rumors. Urban legends persist about what lies beneath the surface. Stories of underground metro lines connecting the institutes. Rumors of hidden bunkers designed to house the elite in the event of a nuclear exchange. While many of these stories were exaggerations, the underground city was partially real. A massive network of utility tunnels wide enough for a truck ran beneath the streets to protect the infrastructure from the -40-degree winters. This subterranean world was the mirror image of the high-reaching buildings above. It was a reminder that even a city of light had to be rooted in the dark, frozen earth. Chapter 11: The Long Winter, the Era of Stagnation. Host: as the 1970s arrived, the momentum of the 1968 expansion began to stall. Leonid Brezhnev's USSR was entering the era of stagnation. The bold, revolutionary spirit of the early science city was being replaced by a thick layer of gray ash. The funding didn't disappear, but the excitement did. The buildings from the 68 expansion began to show their age. Concrete cracked. Glass became dull. The bureaucracy that Lavrentiev had tried to escape finally caught up. Decisions that used to take days now took years. The scientists who were young rebels in 1968 were now aging administrators. They were no longer looking for the next breakthrough, they were looking for a quiet life. The Under the Integral Cafe remained closed. The jazz was replaced by state-approved radio. The expansion had physically completed, but the scientific revolution had been put into a deep freeze. Akademgorodok became a beautiful museum of a future that never quite arrived. It was a city waiting for a change that felt like it would never come. Chapter 12, The Great Unraveling, 1991 and the Winter of Despair. Host, then, the world broke. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Almost overnight, the funding for Akademgorodok vanished. The science city became a ghost town. The 1990s were a period of profound heartbreak. These were men and women who had built the Soviet atomic shield and the space program. Now, they were standing in the snow, selling their leather boots and rare book collections just to buy bread. The heating in the great halls of the 1968 expansion failed. Scientists worked by candlelight, wearing 3 layers of coats. This led to the great brain drain. Thousands of the brightest minds left. They took their brilliance to Stanford, to MIT, to Tel Aviv, and to Berlin. It was one of the largest migrations of intellect in human history. The expansion of 1968, designed to make the USSR a leader of the world, ironically ended up fueling the technological booms of the West. For those who stayed, it was a test of endurance. They guarded their labs like sacred temples, waiting for the light to return. Chapter 13, The Silicon Taiga, The Rebirth of the Dream. Host, we conclude our story in the present day. If you visit Akademgorodok today, you will see a strange and wonderful sight. Next to the gray, brutalist towers of the 1968 expansion stand the shimmering glass pyramids of the Akadem Park. The city has been reborn. It is no longer a government project, it is a hub for private innovation. Startups specializing in biotechnology, software, and nanotechnology are thriving in the same woods where Lavrentiev once walked. The infrastructure of the 1968 expansion provided the foundation for a new generation of Silicon Taiga entrepreneurs. Why did it survive? Because the 1968 expansion wasn't just about buildings. It was about a culture. It was about the belief that even in the most hostile environment on Earth, the human mind can create something beautiful. As we look back at the 1968 expansion of Akademgorodok, we see a lesson for the future. You can build the most advanced labs in the world, but if you don't allow the people inside them to be free, the science will eventually wither. But if you plant the seeds of curiosity deeply enough, they will survive the longest winters. Thank you for listening to this special series on Synapse Daily. We've traveled from the frozen birch forests to the edge of the subatomic world. The story of Akademgorodok is the story of us, our ambition, our failures, and our enduring quest for the light of reason. Like this video if you learned something new. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more fascinating stories. I'm your host, signing off. Keep your neurons firing, and we'll see you next time.